Well, I know I can't match the eloquence of any of these folks. I'm kind of a last-minute substitute, so I'll try to be brief. My name is Alan Prendergast. I write for Westward. I want to talk about two episodes, one of which I have some firsthand experience with, just here in Colorado. You don't have to go to Georgia to find innocent people being executed. There's a famous case in Colorado which has been mostly forgotten, but in the late 1930s there was a man named Joe Aridi who was 23 years old and he had an IQ of 46. And he was found wandering the railroad yards in Cheyenne. He was questioned by the police, who found out he was from Pueblo, where there'd just been a very horrific murder of a young girl who was the daughter of a prominent politician. And within a few hours, they had a confession from a very non-verbal young man. The elated sheriff of Cheyenne then called Pueblo to say, "We've got your guy." It was a big problem because they already had found the murder weapon in another fellow's home in Pueblo. And somehow this case became a conspiracy between these two who must have committed the murder together even though they never met. And Joe Aridi was sent to death row, where he spent most of his time playing with toy trains. He had no idea what they were doing to him. And they led him to the death house on the final day after many, many appeals. There were a couple of lawyers who, it was just very obvious this guy couldn't have done this. In fact, he had an alibi. He didn't know that, but they investigated and they found one. The end result was that on the final day, they told him that he had to give up his train, but he was going to get some golden wings instead. And they took him up to the gas chamber and executed him. And about 3 years ago, Governor Ritter posthumously pardoned him, sort of saying, oops, many years later. The case I'm familiar with, to some degree, is the only execution we've had in this state in the last 45 years. And this is not your classic innocent man. If you want to make a case for the death penalty, I suppose somebody like Gary Davis would be a good case because he was, there's no question that he committed terrible crimes. Probably more crimes than he ever was charged with. He was a rapist, a blackout drunk. He and his wife took a young mother named Virginia May out into a field and raped her and shot her 14 times. And that was in the early 80s. About 15 years later, in 1997, they finally are getting close to execution. And it's interesting to think about this, and as a journalist to experience this, because Colorado, not having done an execution for many years, had a lot of work to do. They had to, first of all, get the right lethal injection drugs. They had to go to Texas and learn how to do this stuff. A lot of news organizations sent their top reporters to cover a few executions in Texas just to get the feel for it, trying to get acquainted with this. And there were over 100 different news organizations that showed up in a double-wide trailer across the road from the Colorado State Penitentiary where the execution was going to take place. I was there. I fortunately was not one who was in the pool to actually witness. There were like 5 media participants who were allowed to actually witness the injection. But everybody else is stuck in this trailer getting dispatches and updates all day long. And what was fascinating to me was how we tried to normalize this procedure. This was something that hadn't been done in Colorado in years, and they were trying to make it seem like just another bit of business. I remember Ari Zavaris, the head of the DOC, going on the radio to explain what was about to take place was a statutorily mandated function. And they kept referring all day long to the protocol. The protocol is being followed. The protocol is on schedule. And there were these little bulletins. What did Gary Davis have to eat for lunch? Is he seeing the pastor now? He's chosen ice cream as his final meal. He's going to have his ice cream with the warden. This was all this trivia and minutiae, which was at the end an attempt to sort of just make this seem normal somehow. And the most interesting part of that whole process was the unscripted part, which came at the very end. There were several delays, and then finally the word was coming back to the trailer that they were going ahead with the execution. And at that moment, you could look across the road at CSP, and the lights were flickering all over the penitentiary. They weren't really. What was happening was that these inmates in their solitary cells had all coordinated a protest, and they were holding their blankets up to the light over and over to create this weird, eerie effect as the death occurred. And it was their attempt to communicate to the media, their own outrage about this, and their sense that, these are human beings in here. This is not normal. This is not, something that should ever become normal. So that was an interesting experience. And the irony of all this, of course, is that Davis was in many ways a volunteer for the death penalty. He'd spent many years in solitary confinement. He had waived many of his appeals, which is the only way that they ultimately got around to executing him in as short a time as 14 years. There's this incredible disconnect between the time the crime happens and these executions many years later, particularly in Colorado. And in Davis's case, if he hadn't done that waiver, and I think he did it because, well, I know he did it because I had access to his letters because of his many years in solitary confinement, and he thought that life in prison was a far worse fate than the death penalty. I think you could make that case today with many of the other cases that we're going through in Colorado. But in his case, he sort of, I think, was resigned to this and saw it as a better fate than spending the rest of his life in prison. But that's my observation about that.